If he loves you, why does his silence hurt more than his words ever did? Why does someone who once chased you now pretend you don't exist? What if his ignoring you isn't indifference, but fear, pride, and inner conflict? Today, we break the illusion, because sometimes when a man truly cares, he doesn't run towards you. He runs away from his feelings. When a man ignores someone he loves because he is afraid of losing control, the silence is rarely casual or careless. It is usually born in the exact moment when emotions begin to feel too strong, too consuming, or too disruptive to the structure he has built inside himself. Control, for many men, is not just a preference, it is a survival strategy learned over years of pressure, expectations, and emotional conditioning. From a young age, he may have been taught, directly or indirectly, that to feel deeply is to risk weakness, and to risk weakness is to lose authority over his life. When love enters with its intensity and unpredictability, it threatens that inner order. Ignoring becomes a way to pause the emotional storm, to slow down the feelings that are beginning to take over his thoughts, decisions, and sense of self. Control often represents safety. For someone who has learned to regulate his world by staying emotionally guarded, falling in love feels like stepping onto unstable ground. Suddenly, someone else's presence can influence his mood, his confidence, and even his future plans. That level of emotional dependence feels dangerous to someone who prides himself on self-reliance. Instead of expressing fear or confusion, he chooses distance. Silence allows him to reclaim the illusion that he is still in charge of his emotions, that no one has the power to disrupt his internal balance. Ignoring you is not always a rejection. Sometimes it is a desperate attempt to feel steady again. The fear of losing control is often intensified by past experiences. If he has been hurt before, abandoned, betrayed, or emotionally overwhelmed in a previous relationship, his mind remembers the pain long before his heart remembers the joy. Love begins to activate old wounds, and instead of confronting them, he retreats. Ignoring you becomes a protective reflex, a way to prevent history from repeating itself. In his mind, distance equals prevention. If he pulls away early, he believes he can avoid the devastation he once endured, even if the present situation is entirely different. There is also a deeper psychological layer to this behavior. Control is closely tied to identity. For many men, being composed, rational, and emotionally contained is part of how they define themselves. Love challenges that identity because it introduces vulnerability, unpredictability, and emotional exposure. When he notices himself caring too much, thinking about you too often, or feeling anxious about your perception of him, it creates internal conflict. Ignoring you becomes a way to silence those parts of himself that feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He is not just avoiding you, he is avoiding a version of himself he does not fully understand. Sometimes the fear of losing control is connected to power dynamics. Love can shift the balance of power in a relationship, especially when one person feels more emotionally invested. If he senses that you matter to him more than he is willing to admit, it can make him feel exposed. Ignoring you restores a sense of dominance, not necessarily over you, but over the situation. It reassures him that he still has the ability to withdraw, to detach, to decide when and how emotions are expressed. This behavior is less about manipulation and more about self-preservation, even though it can feel deeply hurtful on the receiving end. Emotional control is often mistaken for emotional strength. Many men grow up believing that strength means not reacting, not expressing, and not depending on others. When love begins to soften those rigid boundaries, it feels like weakness rather than growth. Ignoring you allows him to return to familiar emotional territory where he feels competent and secure. He may convince himself that distance is maturity, that silence is logic, and that emotional restraint is wisdom. In reality, it is fear wearing the mask of discipline. Another reason he ignores you to maintain control is the fear of losing focus in other areas of his life. Love can be distracting. It can make priorities shift, routines change, and ambitions feel secondary. If he is deeply invested in his career, personal goals, or self-image, he may worry that emotional attachment will derail his progress. Instead of integrating love into his life, he attempts to compartmentalize it. Ignoring you becomes a way to keep emotions from spilling into areas he believes must remain untouched. He is trying to manage his life by limiting emotional variables. There is also the fear of emotional exposure. Loving someone means revealing insecurities, flaws, and unhealed parts. For someone who values control, exposure feels like surrender. Ignoring you allows him to keep his inner world hidden. Silence becomes a wall that protects him from having to explain himself, confront his fears, or admit how deeply he feels. It is easier to disappear than to say, "I'm scared of how much you matter to me." Control can also be linked to perfectionism. If he believes that he must have everything figured out before committing emotionally, love feels premature. He may feel that he needs to be more successful, more stable, or more confident before allowing himself to fully engage. Ignoring you gives him time to feel prepared, even if that preparation never truly comes. In this mindset, distance is seen as responsibility rather than avoidance. He tells himself he is doing the right thing by stepping back until he feels ready. The internal dialogue during this phase is often intense and contradictory. He may think about you constantly while pretending you do not exist. He may rehearse conversations in his mind that he never has out loud. The silence is not empty. It is crowded with thoughts, doubts, and emotional calculations. Ignoring you is not a sign of peace, but of internal chaos. Control is his attempt to organize that chaos without letting anyone else see it. Sometimes the fear of losing control is amplified by societal expectations. Men are often conditioned to believe that showing emotional need is unattractive or weak. He may worry that if he expresses how much he cares, he will lose respect or desirability. Ignoring you becomes a way to maintain a certain image, both to you and to himself. He chooses distance over honesty, because honesty feels risky in a world that often punishes emotional openness. There are moments when ignoring you is his way of testing himself. He wants to see if he can detach, if he can regain emotional neutrality. He may believe that if he can stop responding, stop engaging, and stop feeling, then he was never truly vulnerable to begin with. This self-test is rarely successful. Feelings do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They often grow stronger in silence. But the attempt itself reveals how deeply control matters to him. Fear of losing control can also stem from uncertainty about the future. Love brings questions about commitment, responsibility, and long-term choices. If he is unsure about where he is going in life, adding another person into that uncertainty feels overwhelming. Ignoring you allows him to postpone decisions he is not ready to face. Silence becomes a temporary refuge from the pressure of clarity. In many cases, he is not aware of why he is behaving this way. The fear operates beneath the surface, disguised as logic, busyness, or emotional detachment. He may genuinely believe that he needs space, or that ignoring you is the healthiest option. Self-awareness often comes later, sometimes too late. In the moment, control feels like the only way to cope with emotions that threaten to dismantle his carefully constructed sense of stability. Ultimately, ignoring someone out of fear of losing control reveals a deep struggle between desire and self-protection. Love invites surrender, while control demands restraint. When restraint wins, silence follows. The absence of communication is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of fear, confusion, and an intense need to remain emotionally intact in a situation that feels anything but safe. When a man does not know how to express love, his silence is not empty. It is crowded with emotions he cannot name, organize, or safely release. Love for him is not a language he R&D fluently. It is something he feels deeply but lacks the emotional vocabulary to translate into words or actions. Instead of saying what he feels, he freezes. Instead of reaching out, he withdraws. Ignoring becomes his default response, not because he does not care, but because he does not know how to communicate care without feeling exposed, awkward, or emotionally clumsy. Many people assume that love naturally comes with expression, but expression is a learned skill. If he grew up in an environment where affection was rarely spoken, where praise was limited, or where emotions were dismissed or mocked, he may never have developed the tools needed to articulate love. Feelings were something to endure privately, not something to share openly. When he loves you, those feelings awaken parts of him that were never exercised. Ignoring you becomes a way to manage emotional overload when he does not know what to say or how to say it. There is often a deep fear of saying the wrong thing. When someone lacks emotional communication skills, they may believe that silence is safer than imperfect expression. He may worry that his words will sound weak, confusing, or insufficient. He may fear being misunderstood or judged for how he feels. Rather than risk vulnerability through flawed communication, he chooses silence. In his mind, saying nothing feels less dangerous than saying something that reveals how unprepared he is to express love. Love also brings emotional intensity, and without the ability to regulate or articulate that intensity, it can feel overwhelming. He may feel pulled in many emotional directions at once: desire, fear, attachment, uncertainty, and without the skills to process those emotions externally, they remain trapped inside. Ignoring you is not about emotional emptiness, it is about emotional congestion. He does not know how to release what he feels, so he contains it through distance. Sometimes his silence comes from confusion rather than avoidance. He may not fully understand what he is feeling, especially if this level of emotional depth is unfamiliar to him. He might question whether what he feels is love, attachment, fear, or dependency. Without clarity, he hesitates to speak. Ignoring you becomes a pause, a way to buy time to figure himself out before risking emotional exposure. Unfortunately, that pause can stretch into prolonged silence, leaving you feeling unseen and unvalued. There is also the weight of expectation. Society often expects men to express love through action rather than words, yet even those actions require emotional awareness. If he has never been taught how to translate feelings into behavior, he may feel paralyzed. He might care deeply but have no internal blueprint for showing it. The result is inaction, which looks like indifference from the outside but feels like frustration and inadequacy on the inside. Emotional expression requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires safety. If he does not feel emotionally safe, either because of past experiences or internal insecurities, he may struggle to open up. Love exposes parts of him he keeps hidden, including fears, doubts, and unresolved wounds. Ignoring you allows him to avoid confronting those parts. Silence becomes a shield that protects him from the discomfort of emotional nakedness. Sometimes he equates emotional expression with loss of control. Words make feelings real, and once spoken, they cannot be taken back. If he expresses love, he fears it will create expectations he may not know how to meet. Ignoring you keeps things ambiguous, undefined, and emotionally contained. It allows him to feel without committing to expression, which feels safer when he does not trust his ability to communicate consistently. There may also be shame involved. If he believes he should already know how to express love, but does not, he may feel embarrassed by his emotional limitations. Rather than admit confusion or ask for patience, he retreats. Ignoring you becomes a way to hide emotional incompetence behind silence. He may hope that time will somehow teach him what he does not know, without realizing that growth requires engagement, not withdrawal. In some cases, he has learned to associate emotional expression with negative outcomes. Perhaps in the past, when he opened up, his feelings were dismissed, criticized, or used against him. Those experiences teach the nervous system to associate expression with pain. When he begins to care about you, those old lessons resurface. Ignoring you becomes a protective habit rooted in learned emotional avoidance. Love also demands emotional presence, not just emotional feeling. If he has spent most of his life emotionally disconnected from himself or others, presence feels foreign. He may care deeply but lack the capacity to stay emotionally engaged for long periods. Ignoring you is not a conscious decision to withdraw love, it is a reflection of limited emotional endurance. He steps back because he does not know how to stay emotionally present without feeling drained or exposed. There is often a gap between what he feels and what he believes he is allowed to express. Cultural norms, family dynamics, and personal beliefs shape that gap. He may believe that expressing love too openly makes him vulnerable to rejection or loss of respect. Ignoring you becomes a way to love quietly, privately, without breaking internal rules about emotional restraint. Unfortunately, love that is never expressed becomes invisible to the person who needs to feel it. Sometimes he uses silence as a form of emotional self-regulation. When feelings become intense, he pulls away to calm himself. This is not always intentional or strategic. It can be an automatic nervous system response. Ignoring you helps him reduce emotional stimulation when he feels overwhelmed. He may not realize that what feels calming to him feels abandoning to you. A lack of emotional expression can also stem from limited self-awareness. He may not recognize his own emotional patterns or understand how his silence affects others. He might assume that caring internally is enough, without realizing that love requires external expression to be felt. Ignoring you is not meant to cause harm. It is the result of emotional blind spots formed over years of unexamined behavior. When someone does not know how to express love, they often hope that their feelings will somehow be understood without being spoken. They may believe that if the connection is real, words are unnecessary. This belief allows them to avoid the discomfort of expression while still feeling emotionally invested. Ignoring you, in this context, is not rejection, but misplaced faith in unspoken understanding. At the core of this behavior is a mismatch between emotional capacity and emotional responsibility. He feels love but does not know how to carry it outward. Silence becomes the space where love exists without translation, where feelings are real but inaccessible. The absence of communication is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of emotional limitation, shaped by history, fear, and a lack of learned expression. When a man is fighting inner conflict, his behavior often appears contradictory, confusing, and emotionally inconsistent. One moment he feels deeply drawn toward you, and the next he creates distance as if something inside him is pulling him back. This conflict is not imaginary, it is a constant internal struggle between what he feels and what he believes he should feel, between desire and fear, connection and self-protection. Ignoring you becomes the visible outcome of an invisible battle taking place within him, a battle he may not fully understand himself. Inner conflict usually begins when emotions clash with personal beliefs or unresolved fears. He may care for you, think about you often, and feel emotionally connected, yet simultaneously believe that love will complicate his life or expose weaknesses he has worked hard to hide. This creates tension inside him. Instead of choosing one side, he freezes. Ignoring you becomes a way to delay resolution, allowing him to exist in emotional limbo rather than confronting a decision that feels overwhelming. Much of this conflict comes from opposing identities within him. One part of him wants closeness, intimacy, and emotional honesty. Another part values independence, control, and emotional distance. These two parts cannot easily coexist. When the desire for connection grows stronger, the fear-based identity reacts defensively. Silence becomes a compromise between these parts. He does not fully leave, but he does not fully engage either. Past experiences often intensify this inner struggle. If he has been hurt in the past, betrayed, abandoned, or emotionally overwhelmed, his mind may associate closeness with pain. Even if you have done nothing to cause harm, his nervous system reacts as if danger is present. He wants connection, but his instincts urge caution. Ignoring you becomes a way to reduce emotional stimulation while he tries to reconcile the past with the present. There is also the conflict between emotion and logic. He may feel strongly, but his rational mind questions whether the relationship makes sense, whether the timing is right, or whether he is ready for what love demands. Logic and emotion pull him in opposite directions. Rather than openly processing these doubts with you, he internalizes them. Silence becomes the space where he argues with himself, weighing feelings against fears without external input. Inner conflict can also stem from uncertainty about his own worthiness. He may care deeply but doubt whether he can meet expectations, provide stability, or sustain emotional intimacy. Love highlights areas where he feels inadequate. Ignoring you becomes a way to avoid confronting those insecurities. By stepping back, he temporarily escapes the pressure to show up fully as a partner. Sometimes the conflict is rooted in timing rather than feeling. He may love you but feel unprepared due to career stress, financial pressure, or unresolved personal goals. This creates a painful contradiction, wanting emotional closeness while believing he must focus elsewhere. Ignoring you allows him to prioritize what feels urgent without admitting how much it hurts to create distance from someone he cares about. The inner struggle is often worsened by fear of commitment. Commitment represents permanence, responsibility, and change. Even if he desires you, the idea of committing may trigger anxiety about losing freedom or making irreversible choices. He may go silent not because he wants to leave, but because he is overwhelmed by the implications of staying. Ignoring you becomes a way to slow things down when his mind is racing ahead. Emotional conflict also arises when he is unsure how you feel or fears that his feelings are not reciprocated at the same depth. Rather than risk rejection, he withdraws. Silence feels safer than vulnerability. In this case, ignoring you is less about indifference and more about self-protection in the face of emotional uncertainty. There are moments when he believes that distancing himself is the responsible thing to do. He may think that his confusion could hurt you if he stays close. Instead of communicating that uncertainty, he chooses absence. This choice often comes from a flawed sense of care, where he believes silence is kinder than honesty, even though the opposite is usually true. Inner conflict can also involve moral or cultural values. He may struggle between what he feels and what he was taught is acceptable or appropriate. Family expectations, societal norms, or personal principles may clash with his emotional reality. Ignoring you becomes a way to avoid confronting those contradictions, allowing him to maintain internal consistency at the cost of emotional connection. The longer the conflict remains unresolved, the It becomes. He may feel guilt for ignoring you while simultaneously feeling relief from the emotional pressure. These opposing emotions feed the cycle of distance. Silence becomes both a source of comfort and a source of distress, reinforcing the internal battle rather than resolving it. He may also fear that expressing his inner conflict will make him appear weak, indecisive, or unreliable. Instead of admitting confusion, he hides behind silence. Ignoring you preserves an image of emotional control, even if that image is fragile and incomplete. He chooses how he is perceived over how he truly feels. Inner conflict often thrives in silence because silence requires no accountability. As long as he does not speak, he does not have to confront consequences or make decisions. Ignoring you keeps possibilities open while avoiding commitment to any single path. It is emotional procrastination disguised as distance. In many cases, he hopes the conflict will resolve itself with time. He believes that clarity will eventually emerge without confrontation. Ignoring you becomes a waiting strategy, even though unresolved emotions rarely disappear on their own. The silence is filled with constant mental negotiation, emotional tension, and unspoken longing. At its core, fighting inner conflict means being divided against oneself. Love pulls him forward, fear pulls him back, and silence becomes the space where he remains suspended between the two. Ignoring you is not the absence of feeling, but the manifestation of an unresolved emotional war, one that continues quietly beneath the surface while outward communication fades. When a man believes that distance protects him, ignoring the person he loves becomes a strategy rooted in self-defense rather than indifference. In his mind, emotional closeness carries risk. The closer he gets, the more he feels exposed to pain, disappointment, or loss. Distance feels like armor. Silence becomes a boundary he can control when emotions begin to feel unpredictable. By pulling away, he convinces himself that he is minimizing danger, even if that distance slowly erodes the connection he is trying to protect himself from losing. This belief often forms early in life. If he learned that closeness leads to hurt, through inconsistent caregivers, emotional neglect, or unstable relationships, his nervous system associates intimacy with threat. Love does not feel safe, it feels volatile. When he begins to care deeply, his instinct is not to lean in but to retreat. Ignoring you becomes an automatic response, not a calculated choice. Distance reassures him that he is less vulnerable, less dependent, and therefore less likely to be wounded. Distance also provides emotional predictability. Relationships involve uncertainty. Moods change, feelings deepen, conflicts arise. For someone who struggles with emotional unpredictability, distance feels stable. When he ignores you, he reduces emotional variables. He knows what silence feels like. He has survived it before. Engagement, on the other hand, requires adaptability and emotional risk. By creating space, he believes he is maintaining balance in a world that feels emotionally overwhelming. There is also the fear of emotional escalation. Love tends to grow when nurtured, and growth brings responsibility. Distance slows that process. Ignoring you allows him to control the pace of emotional involvement. He may believe that by stepping back, he can prevent feelings from becoming too intense too quickly. This illusion of moderation helps him feel safer, even though it often creates confusion and pain for the other person. For some men, distance is how they regulate emotions. When feelings rise, they withdraw to calm themselves. This pattern can be mistaken for coldness, but it is often a coping mechanism. Ignoring you is his way of reducing emotional stimulation when he feels overwhelmed. He may not realize that while distance soothes his anxiety, it amplifies yours. In his internal logic, space equals safety. Distance also gives him time to think, analyze, and rationalize his emotions. Instead of feeling, he thinks. Instead of expressing, he processes internally. Ignoring you creates a pause where he can convince himself that he is being cautious, not avoidant. He may believe that if he takes enough time away, clarity will emerge without the discomfort of conversation or vulnerability. Sometimes he believes that distance protects both of you. He may think that his uncertainty, fear, or emotional instability could hurt you if he stays close. Rather than communicating that fear, he chooses silence. This form of distancing is often framed internally as consideration, even though it removes your ability to understand or respond. He convinces himself that absence is kinder than honesty. Distance can also feel like control over outcomes. When he stays emotionally engaged, he risks outcomes he cannot predict: rejection, conflict, deeper attachment. By ignoring you, he limits those possibilities. He may believe that as long as he does not fully engage, he cannot fully lose. This mindset turns distance into a safety net, even though it often guarantees emotional loss in a different form. There is also the fear of being seen too clearly. Emotional closeness exposes flaws, insecurities, and unresolved issues. Distance allows him to present a controlled version of himself, or no version at all. Ignoring you protects him from scrutiny and emotional evaluation. Silence becomes a place where imperfections remain hidden and unchallenged. Distance can feel like independence. If he values self-sufficiency, emotional reliance on another person may feel threatening. Ignoring you reassures him that he is still autonomous, still capable of standing alone. He may fear that closeness will make him dependent, and dependence feels like weakness. Distance reinforces the belief that he is in control of his emotional life. Sometimes distance is used to test feelings. He may pull away to see if the emotions fade or intensify. Ignoring you becomes an experiment rather than a decision. He wants to know whether what he feels is temporary or real. Unfortunately, this test often causes harm, as silence creates emotional insecurity rather than clarity. Distance also provides escape from accountability. When he engages emotionally, he becomes responsible for his words, actions, and impact. Ignoring you removes that responsibility. Silence requires no explanation, no follow-through, no emotional labor. In moments when responsibility feels heavy, distance feels light. There are cases where distance protects him from internal conflict. Being close to you may force him to confront truths he is not ready to face, about his readiness, his fears, or his limitations. Ignoring you allows him to avoid those confrontations. Silence delays self-reflection, keeping uncomfortable realizations at bay. Distance can become addictive because it offers immediate relief. The moment he pulls away, anxiety decreases. That relief reinforces the behavior, even if the long-term consequences are damaging. Ignoring you becomes a habitual response to emotional stress, not a thoughtful choice. In many situations, he genuinely believes that distance is temporary. He plans to return once he feels safer, stronger, or clearer. Ignoring you is framed as a pause, not an ending. However, emotional distance has a way of creating its own momentum, making reconnection harder the longer silence persists. At its core, the belief that distance protects him is built on fear rather than trust. He trusts space more than connection, silence more than communication. Ignoring you is his attempt to survive emotions he does not know how to navigate openly, choosing isolation as a shield against vulnerability, even as that shield quietly pushes love further away. When pride is stronger than courage, silence becomes a substitute for honesty. A man may feel deeply, care intensely, and think about you constantly, yet still choose to ignore you because admitting those feelings requires bravery he does not believe he has. Pride convinces him that revealing emotion is a loss of status, a surrender of strength, or an invitation to vulnerability he cannot control. Courage would ask him to speak despite fear. Pride tells him to stay quiet and protect his image. In that conflict, silence often wins. Pride is often built as armor. Over time, he may have learned that showing emotion leads to judgment, rejection, or diminished respect. To survive those experiences, he constructed a version of himself that appears unaffected, composed, and self-contained. When love threatens to crack that armor, pride steps in to reinforce it. Ignoring you allows him to maintain the illusion that he is untouched, unbothered, and in control, even if internally he feels anything but calm. Courage requires humility, and humility is uncomfortable for someone who has relied on pride to feel safe. To say, "I miss you, I'm afraid," or "I care more than I expected," means admitting uncertainty. Pride resists uncertainty because it challenges the narrative of strength and self-sufficiency. Ignoring you is easier than admitting that someone else now has emotional influence over him. Silence preserves his sense of dominance over his inner world, even as that world becomes increasingly conflicted. Sometimes pride masks insecurity. The louder the pride, the deeper the fear underneath. He may worry that if he opens up, he will be rejected, misunderstood, or seen as inadequate. Rather than risk that exposure, he withdraws. Ignoring you becomes a way to avoid facing the possibility that his feelings may not be enough, welcome, or reciprocated. Pride tells him it is better to disappear than to be seen wanting. There is also the fear of losing leverage. Expressing love can feel like handing over power, especially if he believes that the person who cares less holds more control in a relationship. Pride encourages emotional restraint as a strategy. Ignoring you allows him to feel that he is not the one reaching, not the one waiting, not the one risking more. This dynamic is not always conscious, but it shapes behavior nonetheless. Pride often confuses emotional openness with weakness. If he has been conditioned to believe that strength means endurance and silence, then courage, true courage, feels counterintuitive. Speaking honestly would require redefining strength as vulnerability, and that shift can feel threatening. Ignoring you allows him to cling to an outdated definition of masculinity or self-worth, even if it costs him connection. In moments of emotional intensity, pride becomes a defense against feeling overwhelmed. When emotions rise, he may feel close to losing composure. Instead of admitting that he is affected, he retreats. Ignoring you helps him regain a sense of emotional distance where pride can reassert itself. Silence becomes a way to cool down without admitting that he was ever heated. There is often regret beneath the pride, though it may not surface immediately. He may replay conversations in his mind, draft messages he never sends, or imagine what he could say if he allowed himself to be honest. Pride stops those words at the threshold. It whispers that reaching out would make him look desperate or weak. Ignoring you becomes an act of self-denial justified by ego. Pride can also be reinforced by past victories. If ignoring people in the past seem to protect him or give him control, he may rely on that strategy again. He trusts pride because it has worked before, even if it has also cost him meaningful relationships. Courage, by contrast, feels unfamiliar and risky. Silence feels safer than growth. Sometimes pride is tied to unresolved shame. If he carries shame about his emotional needs, he may feel embarrassed by how much he cares. Ignoring you allows him to hide those needs from both you and himself. Pride steps in to cover vulnerability with distance, creating the appearance of emotional independence while concealing emotional longing. There is also the issue of accountability. Courage would require him to take responsibility for his feelings and their impact on you. Pride avoids accountability by avoiding communication. Ignoring you means he does not have to explain himself, clarify intentions, or face the consequences of honesty. Silence becomes a way to escape emotional responsibility while maintaining a sense of superiority or control. Pride thrives in ambiguity. As long as nothing is said, nothing is confirmed. He can tell himself multiple stories about what he feels and why he is silent. Courage would collapse those stories into truth, and truth can be uncomfortable. Ignoring you allows pride to keep reality flexible and undefined, protecting him from confronting his own emotional truth. In some cases, pride is fueled by fear of dependence. Caring deeply can make him feel emotionally reliant, and reliance feels dangerous to someone who values autonomy above all else. Ignoring you reassures him that he is still standing on his own, even if that independence is lonely. Pride tells him that needing someone diminishes him rather than enriches him. Over time, pride can become isolating. The very behavior meant to protect his self-image begins to erode connection. He may sense this loss but feel trapped by the identity he has built. Ignoring you becomes both a cause and a symptom of that isolation, reinforcing the belief that staying distant is safer than risking closeness. At its core, when pride is stronger than courage, silence is chosen not because love is absent, but because bravery is lacking. He feels, but he does not act. He cares, but he does not speak. Ignoring you becomes the quiet triumph of ego over vulnerability, a choice that preserves pride while quietly suffocating the connection it was meant to protect. When love exists without action, it creates a painful contradiction that is difficult to reconcile. Feelings are present, sometimes intense and genuine, yet they remain trapped inside, unexpressed, and untranslated into behavior. For the person experiencing this kind of love, emotions feel real and alive. For the person on the receiving end, love feels absent, uncertain, and unreliable. Ignoring you in this context is not proof that he feels nothing. It is proof that feelings alone are not enough to sustain connection. Love that never moves beyond emotion becomes invisible, and invisibility is painful. Human beings do not experience love only through intention. They experience it through consistency, presence, and action. When someone claims to care but fails to show it, the gap between words, feelings, and behavior creates emotional confusion. The mind tries to fill in the blanks, often blaming itself for the absence of effort. Ignoring you while claiming to love you places the emotional burden on you to interpret silence NCE, turning love into a puzzle rather than a shared experience. Feelings without action often stem from emotional immaturity or fear. He may feel deeply, but lack the courage, skills, or readiness to translate those feelings into commitment, communication, or reliability. Ignoring you allows him to remain emotionally involved without taking responsibility for the impact of his absence. This creates a one-sided dynamic where you are expected to understand, wait, or hope, while he avoids the discomfort of showing up fully. There is also a psychological comfort in loving from a distance. Loving without acting allows him to experience the emotional highs of attachment without the accountability that comes with presence. He can think about you, miss you, and feel connected in his own mind while remaining detached in reality. Ignoring you preserves his emotional comfort while depriving you of reassurance, stability, and clarity. Love without action often hides behind potential. He may believe that what he feels is enough for now, that someday he will act when circumstances improve, fears subside, or clarity arrives. Ignoring you becomes a temporary state that quietly turns permanent. Potential replaces effort, and promises, spoken or unspoken, replace consistency. Over time, love becomes something that is always about to happen, but never fully arrives. The pain of this kind of love comes from emotional imbalance. You may feel the absence more than he feels the lack of expression. While he carries love internally, you carry uncertainty externally. Ignoring you forces you to live with unanswered questions, emotional insecurity, and the constant effort of interpreting silence. Love that requires guessing quickly becomes exhausting. Action is how love earns trust. Without it, trust erodes even if feelings remain. When he ignores you, the message received is not "I love you quietly, but I am not choosing you actively." The nervous system responds to behavior, not intention. Silence triggers doubt, anxiety, and emotional self-protection, regardless of what he feels internally. Love without action can also become self-serving. He gets to feel emotionally connected without risking rejection, failure, or vulnerability. Ignoring you allows him to avoid moments where love might be tested through conflict, compromise, or commitment. He remains safe inside his feelings while you face the reality of absence alone. There is often a disconnect between how real love feels internally and how real it feels externally. Internally, he may believe his love is strong and sincere. Externally, nothing supports that belief. This disconnect creates emotional gaslighting, even if unintentional. You are left questioning your perceptions, wondering if you are asking for too much when, in truth, you are asking for the minimum expression of care. Low. V, without action, slowly shifts the relationship from partnership to endurance. Instead of sharing experiences, you wait. Instead of communicating, you interpret. Instead of growing together, you remain emotionally suspended. Ignoring you keeps the relationship in a state of emotional stagnation where nothing moves forward, yet nothing fully ends. Sometimes he believes that love should be understood without effort. He may think that if the connection is real, it does not require constant demonstration. This belief allows him to justify silence as normal or harmless. However, emotional bonds weaken without reinforcement. Ignoring you removes the small, everyday actions that keep love alive and felt. The longer love remains inactive, the more it transforms into something else: longing, regret, or emotional residue. Feelings that are not expressed do not disappear, they linger without direction. Ignoring you traps love in a static state, where it cannot grow, evolve, or heal. What remains is a sense of unfinished emotional business that weighs on both people differently. Love without action often protects one person at the expense of the other. He avoids discomfort while you absorb uncertainty. He preserves emotional safety while you experience emotional risk. Ignoring you creates an uneven emotional exchange where care exists but is not shared equally. Over time, this imbalance becomes unsustainable. There is also the erosion of self-worth that can come from loving someone who does not act. You may begin to question whether you are deserving of effort, whether your needs are unreasonable, or whether patience is a virtue rather than a warning sign. Ignoring you teaches you to accept less than you need, even when love is present in theory. Action is the bridge between feeling and reality. Without that bridge, love remains isolated and incomplete. Ignoring you leaves love stranded on one side of the connection, unable to cross into shared experience. Feelings stay real to him, but their impact on you is absence, confusion, and emotional distance. Love that never shows up does not disappear quietly, it leaves marks. It teaches lessons about uncertainty, emotional availability, and the cost of waiting for potential instead of receiving presence. Ignoring you while claiming love is not neutrality. It is a choice that shapes how love is felt, remembered, and ultimately understood. Love is not proven by what someone feels in silence, but by what they are willing to show in action. Understanding why someone pulls away, stays quiet, or hides behind fear may bring clarity, but clarity should never replace self-respect. You can acknowledge their struggle without carrying its weight. You can have compassion without accepting confusion as a standard. Real love does not leave you guessing, shrinking, or questioning your worth. It does not ask you to survive on potential or interpret silence as affection. Love shows up, it speaks, it chooses. And when someone cannot meet you with presence, honesty, and effort, the most powerful response is not waiting. It is honoring yourself enough to step toward what feels clear, safe, and real. Let this be the moment you stop chasing understanding and start choosing peace.